Yeah, so okay, so starting once again. So my name is Mario Rangel. Title of this project is Interrogating Mexican and Mexican American Representation in the World of Hollywood Cinema. I feel like you kind of already know that, but moving forward, um, just regaining some ground from the past presentation. So the project background once again focuses on American cinema, specifically Hollywood's portrayal of land identity, such as Mexican and Mexican American representation in film. It looks at contemporary Hollywood films such as End of Watch 2012 and Sicario 2015 as an example of this. The project examines how these films attempt to validate negative American racialized beliefs of Mexican identity through their fictional narratives focused on the US-Mexico drug war. So objects of analysis, aside from the films themselves, are once again character archetypes such as a Mexican bandit and ethnic avenger. Um, the film's End of Watch Sicario's use of character archetypes such as the Mexican bandit, ethnic avenger serve as key figures of analysis within both films, as their use in relation to one another within their respective narratives operate to further strengthen and support the film's racialized representations of Mexican and Mexican Americans. This can be observed through the image of the Mexican bandit, as visual microaggressions such as banditry and violence are used to convey and communicate racialized messages. Ethnic study scholars Lindsay Perez and Daniel G. Solorzano in their research of Mexican banditry, for instance, to analyze how visual microaggressions carry, quote, the same elements as racial microaggressions, and that they communicate American racist nativist messages through these images, such as dangerous, criminal, undocumented, and do not belong in the United States, and end quote. It is through the film End of Watch and Sicario's use of Mexican banditry that similar racist and nativist messages are used to support stereotypical portrayals of Mexican identity and Mexicanness within Mexican American representation, as Mexican banditry is used as a device in which to support the image of the ethnic avenger, which is coined and described by film scholar John Collins as being a predominantly white heroine who uses violence to defend and avenge the weak. As Mexican banditry allows white lead characters such as Officer Brian Taylor, Kate Macer, and Matt Graver to enact justified violence against minorities such as Mexican and Mexican American characters in order to protect the US and American citizens within their film story worlds from the violence and crime committed by Mexican characters. So the methodology within the project, in order to thoroughly analyze how the films make use of negative racialized stereotypes to portray Mexican identity, thus validate them, I examined the films using an approach that utilizes three forms of analysis: a formal analysis, a textual analysis, and a critical race analysis. So where we left off the last time, I was going to start a scene analysis of a key scene in the film End of Watch. Once again, the key scene, well, the analysis won't have any audio just for analysis reasons, so they may be able to thoroughly speak throughout the scene. And also, once again, the image will contain instances of violence and the use of offensive language. So viewer discretion is strongly warranted for this next slide. And so allow me to navigate us to that scene now. So I begin my interrogation of the film End of Watch and Sicario's use and reinforcement of negative American stereotypes and racist beliefs of Mexican identity by opening with an analysis of a key scene in the film End of Watch, in which spectators are first introduced to the Curbside Gang and its members Lala, played by Flakis, Wicked, played by Dominique, and Demon, played by Richard Cabral, and Big Evil, played by Maurice Campete. So as the scene loads, the scene's opening narrative transition from a peaceful night aerial shot of LA to a threatening introduction of the crew of the Curbside Gang conveys the film's symptomatic meaning, or as film scholar Robert Spadoni eloquently articulates, as being a form of meaning in which levels of, quote, ideology are communicated that reflect social values, and end quote. It is through these social values that we get a sense of what the film attempts to communicate within the scene, which is that negative American stereotypes of Latinos and Latinas, in particular of Mexican and Mexican Americans, have some form of validity in regards to conceptualizing Mexican identity and Mexicanness, which is communicated through the acts of Mexican banditry. We see this conveyed not only through the Curbside Gang's embodiment in acts of violence and crime, but also through their ability to perpetuate and spread violence and crime, which is depicted within the scene during the drive-by scene, conveying that their ability to spread crime is unbounded and that anyone can be a potential victim of their violent and criminal acts. This is a rather amplified within the scene through the use of direct cinema, which is style cinematography associated with the documentary genre, which is seen employed through Wicked's use of a camcorder and its frequent panning around the vehicle, creating various close-up and transition shots of the members of the gang, which makes the scene feel as though it is a form of documentary footage, as use of the camcorder coupled with the character's occasional glances into the shot and intimate conversations creates a sense of liveliness within the scene. This style of direct cinema is yet another method in which the film attempts to validate and reinforce its symptomatic meaning, as American racialized perceptions of Mexican identity and Mexicanness are presented as being real rather than as fictional depictions of Mexican characters, which to some capacity causes the lines between real and fictional representations of Mexican identity become blurred. So pausing there, navigating back to the presentation. So through, once again, utilizing the same three forms of analysis, I observed how films like Sicario are in leagues with film like End of Watch and their attempts to validate racist American beliefs of Mexican and Mexicanness, such as Mexican identity being associated with violence and crime. The film Sicario expands upon its representation of Mexican identity and Mexicanness being violent and criminal through its similar narrative exploration and focus on the US-Mexico drug war and the violence and crime that have emerged through its drug trade economy. As the film depicts how acts of Mexican banditry are not only imaginable in places such as LA, they can also be imagined happening elsewhere in places such as Chandler, Arizona. It is through this reimagining of Mexican banditry happening elsewhere in the US and spreading that make it apparent how films like Sicario seem to be in conversation with films like End of Watch, as its exploration of Mexican representation and Mexicanness under the lens of violence and crime operate to further strengthen and support negative American stereotypes of Mexican identity as the framing of Mexican representation and Mexicanness under the context of violence and crime work to other Mexican characters in the film, which can be seen in the following key scene. So in this slide, I'll be conducting the scene analysis again, but this time within the key scene of the film Sicario. Once again, the analysis won't have any audio just for analysis reasons so that I may be able to thoroughly speak throughout the scene. And also, once again, there will be images of violence and the use of offensive language. So once again, viewer discretion is strongly warranted for this scene as well. So navigating to that scene now. Hopefully this one loads better. So the confrontation between American law enforcement and military personnel, such as Kate Macer, Alejandro, and can best be described as Mexican cartel characters, depicts how Mexican identity and Mexicanness are othered within the scene, as Mexican characters are presented to us as posing a threat, as we are shown how their embodiment, enactment, and ability to perpetuate crime pose a serious risk to Americans and the US within the film story world. As within the scene, we are shown how these Mexican cartel characters attempt to cross and blend in with the traffic leaving Mexico and heading towards the US in order to cause harm to white characters such as Kate Macer. It is through this representation of Mexican characters attempting to migrate over into the US within the scene that we see how the act of migration is presented as a crime, as a portrayal of the Mexican cartel characters carrying and transporting weapons, convey how Mexican migration brings violence and crime, which operates to further reinforce negative American racialized beliefs of Mexican identity, as Mexican banditry is utilized as a way in which to reinscribe and reinforce racist criminalizing narratives of Mexicans and Mexicanness. Now navigating once again back to the presentation. So some aspects and conclusion of the project. Through a screening and analysis of the films End of Watch and Sicario, it is made visible how American films like these utilize their references to real world events in order to validate and naturalize racist beliefs of Mexican identity. The way the film's narratives work to both position their Mexican characters and representations of Mexicanness as being the rather causes of the violence and crime emerging from the US-Mexico drug war within their respective story worlds negatively affects the visibility of Mexican identity, as Mexicans are presented as being a problem and burden to the US. By understanding how films like these work to validate and naturalize racist beliefs of Mexican identity, we're able to understand how their narratives partake in larger media discourses. The film's representation and messages of Mexican identity and Mexicanness being a rather problem and burden to the US partakes in larger media discourses such as those intertwined with media and entertainment outlets like the news and TV programs, as their fictional narratives seemingly aid in the misrepresentation of ethnic identities within the US, which scholars such as Christopher Skubert note as being common methods of American media outlets in order to implement what he refers to as, quote, culture-specific cognitive preconceptions, and end quote, which are more or less American preconceptions of identities that fall outside of the idealistic image of Americanness. These culture-specific preconceptions predominantly take the forms of stereotypes and racialized beliefs, which can be seen in the films End of Watch and Sicario, as they are consequently called upon in order to represent Mexican characters and Mexicanness within the films, which leads to their misrepresentations as harmful images such as violence and crime are passed off as being genuine representations of Mexican identity. and some anticipating questions and takeaways. So I looked at these genres of films to begin with. These types of American films have arguably become the source of inspiration for telling of similar criminalizing narratives of Mexican identity, as their rapid success in American film industries have led to films such as Night of Sicario 2020, directed by Joth Riggs, to partake in exploring and representing Latin identity through the lens of violence and crime, which is similarly, if not identically done through its references to the US-Mexico drug war. And leading to the next question, well, what is at stake in analyzing how violence and crime are used to explore and represent Mexican identity in American cinema? By understanding how violence and crime are used as images in which to racialize Mexican identity and Mexicanness within American films, we can better understand how these media discourses can contribute and hold some form of influence in other areas of ongoing discourses in the US, such as politics, as racialized representations of Latinos and Latinas are called upon in order to validate and naturalize racist beliefs of Latin identities. And leading to the next question, well, what are some ways that American cinema can improve upon its representation of Latin identities? One way American film industries can better represent Latin identity in film is by breaking away from these overly used and circulated criminalizing narratives of Latinos and Latinas, and instead employ other forms of exploring and representing Latinos, Latinas, Latinxes, and Chicanxes, such as exploring the complexity of Latin culture, which we see in films like Disney's Encanto and Coco. Though these films are merely children's fairy tale films on the surface, to some degree, they present a more complex approach to understanding the various forms Latin identity may take in regards to representation. And lastly, or what are some ways that we as spectators can help push for better representation of Latin identities in American cinema? A way we as spectators can help bring about better representations of Latinos, Latinas, Latinxes, and Chicanxes in film is by refusing to support and consume American cinema's singular approaches to representing Latin identity through stereotypes such as violent and criminal. A few ways one may do this is by refusing to purchase tickets to these films and forming friends and colleagues to do the same, and engaging in media discourse such as those seen within film review and academic writing. And with that said, that concludes my presentation. Thank you all so much for being present. I look forward to hearing some of your questions.
Great, thank you, Mario.